the morning they came for me, I remember the cold sting of ash winds on my face, and how the horizon burned red behind shattered hablocks. And I remember thinking that if I looked strong enough, unyielding enough, they might finally see more in me than another dust-born stray. My cheekbones were sharp from half a lifetime of hunger, my skin weathered by the grit storms that never stopped sweeping across our death-world plains, and my pale green eyes, so my clanmother once said, always looked too aware for a child, too old, too hungry for something beyond mere survival. I stood wrapped in the only clothing I truly owned, hardened leather plates stitched onto scorched flak cloth that had been scavenged from abandoned battlefields, still littered with the bones of those who died long before I was born. Every rip and scar across the fabric told a story, but none of them were enough to tell mine. Not yet, not until this moment. The sky trembled as the gunship descended, engines screaming through the dusty air, and the others around me stepped back instinctively, though I did not, my boots planted in the hot cracked earth because fear had long since lost its grip on me. I had survived the bone wolves in the ravines, the poison rains that could flay skin in minutes, the raiders who hunted children for sport, and more nights alone in the ruins than I dared count. I had endured, and endurance was the only currency that mattered on this world. It was why I had been chosen to stand among the final candidates, why my name, my real name, had been spoken aloud by the tribe's elders for the first time since I was a child small enough to hide inside shattered ducts. When the Astartes recruiter stepped out of the drop ramp, he seemed impossibly vast, his armor the deep matte blue of midnight storms, his presence so heavy it pressed on the lungs. Even before he spoke, I felt the weight of responsibility radiating from him, as if he were carved from the very idea of war. His eyes behind the lenses seemed to pierce straight through my sinew and bone, measuring, judging, dissecting the worth of my existence in a single frozen breath. He walked past the others, each of them trembling under the gravity of his gaze. But his attention settled on me, lingering long enough that I felt something inside me coil like a bowstring pulled taut. Not fear, anticipation, a sensation so sharp it was almost painful. I had wanted purpose my entire life, something greater than scavenging the corpses of old wars and running from the next oncoming storm. And now I could feel that desire rising in my chest like a second heartbeat, steady and certain. "You survived where others died," he said, his voice metallic and impossibly calm, and I felt the words strike deeper than any blade. "Step forward." And I did, my jaw clenched, the wind whipping through the torn edges of my armor, dust swirling around my boots, as though the world itself exhaled in that moment. The instant I moved, I knew the trials were beginning, not the ones I had survived before, but the trials that would decide if I was destined to walk the path of the Adeptus Astartes or vanish into the ashes like every forgotten soul before me. The gunship carried us away from the dust-blasted plains in a roar of engines so loud it felt as if the world below were being peeled away from my skin, layer by layer, until only the raw truth of who I was remained. I sat strapped into a metal bench along the rattling interior wall, my patched armor still dusted with the grit of my home. My hands clenched so tightly the knuckles glowed white through the grime. The other chosen candidates avoided my eyes, though I could feel their tension vibrating in the stale air like a barely suppressed tremor. They had all survived horrors of their own, yet I sensed that none of them had walked the razor edge between life and death as often as I had, and that unspoken difference made space between us, a quiet acknowledgement that I would have to stand alone in whatever came next. The Astartes recruiter, our silent warden, stood in the center of the transport bay with absolute stillness, as if turbulence and motion were concepts that applied to lesser beings. His armor caught the dim interior lights in soft glints, blue as midnight oceans I had only ever heard described in old stories. Every time his visor turned slightly, I felt the faint prickle down my spine that told me he was watching, evaluating, taking the measure of every breath I drew. When we finally touched down inside the fortress monastery, the air shifted. I had expected something grand, something ceremonial, but instead we were herded through reinforced corridors that smelled of oil, steel, and old incense, places where the walls seemed to absorb the sound of our footsteps and echo them back with judgment. Servitors with hollowed eyes drifted past on humming grav pallets, their metal limbs clacking rhythmically, as if marking the slow march of our fates. Then began the tests. They wasted no time, no words, no ceremony. We were forced into grueling examinations of mind and body that blurred together in an endless flow, each harder than the last, each designed to peel back every layer of pretense we carried. They watched us run until our lungs burned and our legs seized, climb until fingers cracked and bled, fight until our vision swam with exhaustion. And through all of it, the recruiter, our judge, observed in impassive silence, arms folded across his massive chest as though waiting for something deeper than strength or speed to reveal itself. I felt the weight of his eyes when I refused to fall behind, even as my muscles tore like paper under strain. When I gritted my teeth through the last 100 heartbeats of a trial that had already reduced older boys to unconscious heaps on the floor. Pain had always been my companion, and endurance my only weapon. But they were not merely testing the body. They wanted to see the furnace burning behind the ribs, the resolve that could not be taught or forced. At night, if it could be called night under the dim red lumens of the barracks, the indoctrination lectures began. Not lessons in knowledge, but in purpose, history, and the weight of duty. They spoke of the Legion as if it were a living thing, a lineage woven through gene seed and sacrifice, and I listened with an intensity that surprised even me, absorbing every word like a starving creature tearing into its first real meal. Some of the others seemed overwhelmed. A few broke, quietly or spectacularly, their spirits snapping like brittle wire under the combined pressure of expectation and fear. But inside me, something only tightened, sharpened, steadied. I had not come from a world that allowed weakness to live, and that truth had hardened my will to the point where every new challenge felt almost familiar. And I began to notice that the recruiter watched me more than the rest, not with approval, but with the careful scrutiny reserved for something dangerous that might one day be useful.
They brought us to the apothecarian in silence, the cold sterility of the chamber so different from the dust-choked world I had come from that it felt like stepping into another reality altogether. The air tasted of antiseptic chemicals and recirculated purity, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of blood and smoke I had grown up breathing. I stood there with my patched leather plates folded under one arm, torso bare, the harsh white lights revealing every scar etched into my skin. Thin lines from bone wolves, puckered circles from old lass burns, jagged claw marks that had healed crooked because we'd never had Medicaid supplies worth the name. My body was a map of survival, but in that moment I sensed it wouldn't remain my body for long. The apothecary approached, towering and silent behind his bone-white helm. His presence felt colder than the steel tables lining the walls. His voice, when it finally came through the vox, was steady, clinical, devoid of anything resembling sympathy. Your transformation begins now. You will shed who you were. Those words hit harder than any strike ever had, because deep inside me something responded, a mixture of longing and fear. I had always wanted to become more, but now that the moment was here, the cost suddenly felt immeasurable. The first procedure was the secondary heart, and they held me down for it. Even sedated, the pain crashed through the drugs like a thunderbolt, ripping a raw cry out of my throat that echoed off the metal walls. I tried to choke it back, tried to hold on to the fierce pride of my tribe, but the agony was too immense, too total. It felt as if molten iron were being forced into my chest cavity, reshaping every beat of my existence. When it was done, I lay trembling, sweat pooling beneath me, breath hitching with each attempt to steady myself. The apothecary didn't pause. The next implant was the os modula, a small thing by appearance, a sliver of engineered potential. Yet I felt its influence within hours, bone ache burrowing deep and relentless, spreading like invisible fire through every limb. Pain became a constant companion, gnawing at me even in sleep, twisting my dreams into half-formed nightmares of splitting bone and shifting marrow. But I learned to move through it, to breathe with it, to use the rhythmic pulse of discomfort as an anchor rather than a chain. Days bled into nights, nights into something beyond time. More implants followed, the biscopia swelling muscle fiber until my limbs trembled with new power, the hemastamen rewriting the very composition of my blood. Every addition carved me away from who I had been. Sometimes I caught glimpses of myself in polished steel surfaces, my shoulders broader, veins thicker, eyes burning with something I barely recognized. The transition wasn't elegant. It was raw, feral, transformative in the most violent way imaginable. Some candidates didn't survive. Others broke under the agony or rejected the implants in catastrophic, bloody collapse. The air in the barracks carried a constant undertone of fear, but for me there was only forward momentum. I had endured storms that stripped flesh from bone. I had slept in ruins stalked by things with too many teeth and not enough eyes. My will had been forged long before I arrived here. And yet this pain was different. This pain wasn't simply survival, it was evolution. Every breath felt like a step into the unknown. Every shiver, another fragment of my past falling away. I could feel a new identity forming inside me, slow and relentless as tectonic plates grinding together. I was not Astartes yet, not even close, but the boy from the dust world was dying, piece by agonized piece, and something stronger was taking his place. The chamber where they implanted the gene seed did not feel like a place meant for mortals. It was quiet, too quiet, its walls lined with Gothic arches and rune-etched machinery, humming with a low resonance that vibrated through my bones. I remember how the air felt heavier there, as if the weight of centuries pressed down on it, as if the deeds of every warrior who had come before us lingered in the stillness. By then my body had already changed so much I barely recognized the way my muscles bunched beneath my skin, or how my breath sounded deeper, fuller, carried by two hearts now pounding in synchronized rhythm. But standing in that chamber, stripped to the waist once more, I felt small in a way I hadn't felt since childhood. Small not from fear, but from the immensity of what I was about to become part of. The apothecary approached with ritual precision. servo arms unfolding around him like the limbs of some sacred mechanical arachnid. In his gauntlets he carried a stasis vial, its interior lit with a faint golden glow, something both alive and waiting, suspended in perfect stillness. He held it not as a tool, but as a relic. Within this, he intoned, lies the legacy of the Legion. It is more than flesh. It is memory, purpose, and oath. His voice had none of the cold detachment I had grown used to. There was reverence in it. And in that moment I understood the truth. This was not just a procedure. It was inheritance. They laid me on the steel cradle and locked my limbs into place. Cold metal bit into my wrists and ankles, but I did not struggle. I kept my gaze fixed on the vial as it rose above me, suspended in the grip of a multi-jointed servo arm. The glow intensified, illuminating the edges of the apothecary's helm, and I felt my breath quicken in unconsciously shallow bursts. My second heart hammered with a force that sent tremors rolling through my ribs. I felt the incision even before the anesthetics took hold, felt the pressure, the movement, the mechanical precision of the instruments parting tissue and muscle. But the true pain came when the gene seed was placed within me. It wasn't physical at first. It was something deeper, something primal, as if another presence had slid into the core of my being and begun to unfurl silently through the hollow spaces of my soul. It was both alien and familiar at once, like a voice whispering from the marrow of my bones, carrying echoes of battles fought long before I had drawn my first breath. Then the agony struck. My nerves ignited like a network of burning wires. I felt heat radiate outward from the implant, felt it merge with the rest of my developing organs, threading itself into my bloodstream, my endocrine system, my thoughts. I clenched my teeth so hard I tasted blood, but still I didn't scream. I wouldn't give the pain that victory. My vision blurred, swimming with after-images. Armored giants marching through fire, bolters roaring, banners snapping under alien skies. I didn't know if they were memories or hallucinations, but I felt them imprinting themselves against my consciousness like sigils carved into stone. Eventually, the pain ebbed, leaving me trembling, drenched in sweat, my breath loud in my ears. The apothecary released the clamps, but for a moment I couldn't move. Even when I sat up, I felt different. Not stronger, not yet, but heavier with meaning, as if a door inside me had opened onto a path that stretched far beyond my life, my tribe, my world. I wasn't just being remade, I was being claimed. And from that moment on, my fate no longer belonged to me alone. It belonged to the Legion, whose legacy now pulsed quietly beneath my skin. The combat drills began almost immediately after the gene seed had woven itself into my veins. My body, though still raw from implants and sleepless nights, felt different. Stronger, yes, but also unstable, like a storm coiling beneath my skin. The corridors of the training complex were vast, a labyrinth of steel, stone, and gravity simulators that twisted perception until you were never quite sure which way was up. I learned quickly that survival alone was no longer enough. Here, instinct had to be refined, sharpened into precision. Every strike, every dodge, every fall or leap carried the weight of the legacy now inside me. Failure was not permitted. Death was inevitable if one wavered. They threw us into simulated war zones first, holographic enemies flickering into being, detonations shaking the walls, blinding flashes turning the corridors into chaos. But soon holograms gave way to real weight, live weapons, live targets, and live consequences. My heart pounded with the rhythm of a war I had only glimpsed in dreams, my fists and blades moving faster than thought, guided by a new, almost alien reflex that responded before I could consciously command it.
Pain and fatigue were constant companions. Yet I learned to let them recede into background noise, distractions to be ignored. I remember one session vividly. We were dropped into a chamber rigged with moving platforms over simulated acid pits, enemy figures springing from hidden panels. One candidate misjudged a leap, falling into the pit below. The sound was wet, final, and a silence descended over us. Not mourning. There was no time for that. Only the knowledge that hesitation could cost me as dearly. I tightened my jaw and adjusted my stance, each heartbeat a silent drum that reminded me to move faster, strike harder, and never second-guess the instincts we were being trained to trust. The instructors, some of them veterans older than I could comprehend, monitored us like hawks. Their eyes missed nothing, their criticism precise and merciless. They tested our endurance, our cunning, our ability to adapt to ever-changing threats. Every strike and counter-strike was logged, every misstep dissected. When my own muscles trembled with exhaustion, I would close my eyes for a fraction of a second and feel the second heart pulse beneath my ribs, the osmodulla reinforcing my skeletal structure, the biscopia giving me microseconds of extra strength. I began to realize that the pain and fear were no longer my enemies. They were my teachers. Even sleep offered no relief. We were woken for night drills, forced to navigate obstacle courses in darkness so complete it was easy to imagine the void itself had swallowed us. My senses honed, eyes adjusting to minimal light, ears catching the subtlest footfall. Reflexes I didn't know I possessed surfaced instinctively. When a trainer lunged at me with a combat knife, I blocked, countered, and incapacitated him in under a second. No satisfaction followed, only the relentless reminder that this was not a game. This was survival amplified 1,000-fold, and soon it would be permanent. By the end of the first month, my body ached with new muscles and old injuries alike, and yet I felt a clarity I had never known. Pain no longer dictated my limits. Instinct, will, and training did. The trials were shaping me into something more than human, a soldier whose body and mind moved as one lethal instrument. I had begun to feel the subtle whisper of the Legion in my veins, guiding, assessing, pushing me toward a standard I had never dared imagine I could reach. And still, I hungered for more. Hypno-indoctrination began subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. They did not bind us or blindfold us. Instead, we were seated in chambers with low, pulsing lights, rhythmic sound loops, and soft, continuous chanting beneath the surface of the audio feed. At first, it felt like meditation, an attempt to calm the body after days of relentless training. But quickly I realized my thoughts were not entirely my own. Suggestions crept in, shaping perceptions, molding priorities, bending impulses toward the singular focus the Legion demanded. Resistance was instinctive, but it was also exhausting because the process was a stream rather than a strike, relentless, patient, invisible, and inside your mind before you could name it. I remember the first night vividly. I awoke from a trance in a sweat-soaked chamber, heart thrumming like a drum. My dreams had been vivid, terrifying, a battlefield strewn with corpses, banners of the Legion snapping in windless voids, and yet a sense of rightness pervaded it, a certainty that survival meant more than the body, that loyalty was no longer a choice. The voice in the loop repeated phrases I could not fully recall consciously, but my instincts now acted on them. Fear was stripped down, recalibrated. Hesitation became a flaw I could no longer tolerate. Daylight brought drills, and I noticed subtle changes in myself. The way I evaluated threats, the speed with which I made decisions, the absence of emotional hesitation that once held me back. I observed others breaking under the hypnotic discipline, their minds snapping under layers of implanted ideology, and I felt a quiet, almost detached pity. I too was being reshaped, but my mind, the mind forged in the crucible of Death World survival, was responding differently. I had known pain, fear, and isolation long before arriving here. The hypno-doctrine was merely aligning my instincts with the mission, not creating them. The trainers spoke in calm, surgical tones during the sessions, reminding us of the Legion's purpose, of duty beyond self, of obedience that was not blind but inevitable. They layered it with historical memory, stories of the warriors whose genetic imprint now pulsed in our veins, of battles where hesitation had meant the extinction of entire worlds. I felt my own ego dissolve gradually, replaced by something larger, heavier, and utterly necessary. I began to act without reflection, yet not blindly. My decisions became faster, more precise, lethal in execution. Every movement of my body, every flicker of my gaze, every microsecond of response was honed to serve a singular function: survival and victory for the Legion. Even my thoughts began to echo the rhythm of the doctrine. Where I had once considered personal desire, hesitation, or doubt, now there was only clarity, calculation, and focus. The whispers in my veins, the legacy of my gene seed sounded louder, intertwining with the new commands, a symphony of purpose that resonated through my marrow. Fear and morality became tools, not masters. Instinct became weaponized. By the time the hypno-indoctrination sessions had run their full course, I could sense it. My mind and body were no longer separate entities. Decisions, reactions, and instincts flowed through me as though guided by an invisible conductor. I was no longer just a survivor. I was a weapon, and my will had been sharpened to align perfectly with the Legion's unyielding standards. The boy from the dust world was gone. In his place stood something forged, disciplined, and ready.
The first time I donned the power armor, I felt its weight before I even touched it. It was not just metal. It was a second skin, a living exoskeleton that bore the history of thousands of warriors before me. The servo motors hummed softly when I adjusted the plating, responding to the subtle movements of my body. At first, the sensation was alien. Every joint, every tendon, every muscle had to relearn its place. My own strength felt doubled, tripled, yet my body protested, muscles straining to accommodate the unnatural contours and the invasive systems interfacing directly with my nervous network. The helmet slid over my head like a cage, lenses locking into place over my eyes, and the world became filtered, sharpened, every detail amplified, every shadow a potential threat. Training in the armor was a relentless assault. We moved through corridors rigged with obstacles, through chambers filled with live fire and simulated blasts, and through zero-gravity chambers where movement demanded perfect coordination of the servo-assist limbs. The first time I fell, the armor's bulk slammed me into the steel floor, wind forced from my lungs. Pain, old and familiar, flared in my body. But the suit learned me as I learned it. Each fall, each misstep, each stumble became a lesson. My reactions began to anticipate the armor's own feedback, the way it shifted weight, the servo hums adjusting to my speed. It was symbiosis, not simple machinery. I was no longer separate from it, and yet it was more than an extension. It was part of me. Combat drills escalated, the instructors testing our cohesion with the armor in ways that pushed both body and mind to extremes. We ran assaults on multi-level training grids, fought simulated squads that reacted unpredictably, and executed maneuvers that required thinking and reflexes faster than thought itself. The suit magnified my strength, endurance, and resilience, but it demanded total integration.
A miscalculated strike or delayed response could not only cost the exercise, but risk real injury. I learned to trust the feedback that coursed through the neural interface, to feel the armor as if it were bone beneath my skin, to anticipate every shift, every recoil, every weight adjustment as instinctual. In between drills, we practiced maintenance and emergency procedures. A Marine separated from his suit in the field was dead, and the truth was made clear in brutal lessons. Hydraulic failures, simulated breaches, and rapid egress drills tested our speed, calm, and precision. Each mistake burned into memory, and each success strengthened the connection between flesh and machine. I began to sense the subtle cues of the armor before they manifested. A servo struggling under weight, a joint resisting motion, and misalignment in sensors. It became not just protection, but a weapon, a companion, and a teacher, all at once. By the end of the acclimation period, the line between man and armor blurred. I could run, jump, and fight in ways my unaugmented body could never achieve. The armor responded as though it had been part of me all along. Every strike I delivered carried the force of a mountain. Every movement became precise, fluid, lethal. And yet, beneath it all, the whispers of the gene seed, the echoes of hypno-doctrine, and the relentless combat conditioning melded into something greater. A machine of flesh and steel, tuned for war and ready to stand against any threat. I looked at my reflection in the inner walls of the armor bay, and the figure staring back was unrecognizable. The boy who survived the dust world storms was gone. In his place stood a warrior honed to perfection, bound to a purpose older than time, ready to become legend.
The final proving was unlike anything I had imagined. Months of relentless training, implants, hypno-doctrine, and armor acclimation had built me into something beyond ordinary men. But the proving stripped everything down to a raw, unyielding truth. Survival, endurance, and loyalty could be measured only against death itself. The chamber was massive, a cathedral of steel and reinforced ceramite, filled with environmental hazards, live targets, and complex terrain that demanded precision and adaptability at every step. From the moment we entered, there was no hesitation, no pretense, only the unbroken chain of action, reaction, and calculation. They released us into the proving grounds with minimal instruction. A simulated city burned around us, walls collapsing, smoke thick enough to choke, laser fire cutting arcs across corridors. My augmented senses cut through the chaos. The osmodula and biscopia gave me strength, speed, and endurance beyond any human measure, while my gene seed whispered strategies, instincts, and warnings, as though the Legion itself were beside me, guiding every movement. I fought through corridors filled with traps, through shadows where hidden marksmen waited, through collapsing floors that tested my reflexes to the millisecond. Every step demanded perfection. Every decision carried consequence. I remember one point when a wall of fire separated me from my target. Muscle and mind screamed in protest, but I didn't hesitate. The power armor adjusted seamlessly, hydraulics straining but never failing, servos pushing me forward as if they knew the calculation my human brain couldn't process in time. I plunged through, landing atop a crumbling steel beam, balancing as the heat blistered the air around me. I took down the simulated enemies, one after another, each strike guided by reflex, experience, and the silent counsel of the gene seed. I realized then that I was no longer acting alone. Every augment, every implant, every lesson fused into a single lethal entity. My will merged with the machine of war inside me. Hours passed, though time seemed meaningless. We were pushed to the brink, challenged with puzzles, ambushes, and sudden brutal engagements that demanded not only brute force but tactical genius. Other candidates faltered. Some were incapacitated, their failures echoing across the proving halls like ghostly warnings.
I pressed on, my body screaming with exhaustion, my mind operating at a speed impossible for a normal man. Pain, fatigue, and fear no longer existed in the conventional sense. They were tools to manipulate, thresholds to break, challenges to overcome. I had become something both terrifying and sublime, a transhuman instrument, honed to perfection. At the end, I stood alone in the ruins of the simulated battlefield, breathing heavily, blood and soot streaking my face and armor. Silence fell, absolute and complete. Then the apothecaries and trainers entered, inspecting the survivors. I felt no pride, no relief, only a cold, settling weight of understanding. I had crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. The boy who survived the Dust World storms, the survivor who endured wolf packs, raiders, and ruin, he was gone. In his place, bound to the gene seed, the doctrine, and the legion, stood a warrior ready to wield destiny as a weapon. Every breath was now part of something larger, every heartbeat a rhythm in the symphony of war that would span worlds and centuries. I was no longer mortal in the old sense. I had become the thing I had sought my entire life, eternal purpose, forged in flesh, steel, and unbreakable will.
I stand now in the quiet aftermath, alone in a hall where my own reflection seems distant, like a memory of someone else. The trials are over, but the echoes remain, deep in muscle, bone, and blood. I remember the Dust World plains, the wolf packs, the raiders, the night spent shivering in ruined shelters. Every hardship and every scar were not erased, but refined into something sharper, something eternal. The gene seed pulses within me, a heartbeat of legacy and war, a reminder that my body is no longer mine alone, but a vessel of centuries of battle and sacrifice. The hypno-doctrine and combat conditioning have merged with instinct, thought, and purpose until they are indistinguishable. The armor waits silently in its bay, a second skin that is now extension, shield, and weapon, prepared for any engagement. I have walked beyond what was human, and yet carry all of it in me. Memory, instinct, and the relentless hunger to survive. Each challenge faced, each procedure endured, every lesson in pain and discipline has bound me closer to the Legion. I am aware of the cost, identity, autonomy, childhood, mortality. They are fragments of a past self that now exist only as faint echoes. And yet there is no regret, only clarity. The proving was not about becoming stronger, faster, or deadlier. It was about becoming inevitable. A space marine is not born, not chosen by chance. He is forged, welded in fire and blood to purpose and legacy, until nothing remains that can stand against him, nothing that can shake him from the path he has been given. I am more than flesh. I am the sum of millennia of warriors, the instrument of the Legion, a weapon tempered by pain and sharpened by duty. I have survived, endured, and been remade beyond mortality. My eyes, once pale and searching, now see the battlefield before it even manifests. My hands, once weak and calloused, now grip destiny as surely as they do bolter and blade. The boy from the Dust World is gone. In his place stands something eternal, prepared to carry the war of the Legion across stars, centuries, and the void itself. There is only the mission, only the legacy, only the unbroken will. And I am ready.